In the rain-soaked hallways of Raven Ridge High School, a seemingly quiet transfer student was about to face her first real test. What started as typical teenage bullying took a shocking turn when privileged predators came face to face with a weapon they never saw coming. Lina Kade wasn't your typical 16-year-old. For most of her life, she had spent her days in military compounds and foreign safe houses, trained by her adoptive father, a decorated special forces operative known for her ability to assess threats and neutralize them with surgical precision. When she encountered Dax Mercer and his crew trying to steal her worn military backpack, they had no idea they were targeting someone carrying classified intelligence that could topple governments. Lina's lightning-fast response that would lead to exposing a shadow network of corruption while transforming an entire school's social ecosystem. What began as entitled bullies asserting dominance would become a quiet revolution. Raven Ridge High School would never be the same after one girl taught an entire generation that real strength comes from protecting others, not preying on them. The bullies thought they were stealing from a helpless new student. Instead, they awakened something far more dangerous than they could imagine, and discovered that some prey fights back with training that turns hunters into the hunted. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The October rain drummed against the tall windows of Raven Ridge High School as Lina Kade adjusted the worn straps of her military surplus backpack and stepped through the imposing glass doors for the first time at 16. She stood 5'4" with a lean frame that moved with an economy of motion most teenagers never possessed. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and she wore simple jeans and a gray hoodie that had seen better days, but beneath the unremarkable exterior, her pale green eyes swept the hallway with the methodical precision of someone trained to assess threats and exits in seconds. Just blend in, keep your head down, survive the next year and a half, she told herself as clusters of students in designer clothes flowed around her like water around a stone. The hallways of Raven Ridge buzzed with the entitled energy of Pacific Northwest privilege, where logging fortunes had transformed into tech money and political influence. The students here carried themselves with the confidence that came from never having to worry about anything more serious than which BMW to take to school. Lina felt like she was walking through an alien world entirely different from the sparse military bases and foreign compounds, where she'd spent most of her life learning to disappear into crowds while staying hyper-vigilant for danger. "Excuse me, could you tell me where the main office is?" she asked quietly to a perfectly groomed girl with honey blonde hair who looked like she'd stepped out of a catalog. The girl glanced at Lina's worn backpack and secondhand clothes with barely concealed disdain. "Down the hall, obviously. Can't you see the signs?" she said, before walking away, leaving Lina standing alone in the current of students who parted around her like she was invisible. In the main office, Principal Hadley Rourke studied the thin file on his desk with the measured gaze of someone who'd spent years analyzing intelligence reports before transitioning to education. The official paperwork for Lina Kade looked standard enough: homeschooled daughter of a retired military contractor, transferring mid-semester due to her father's new consulting job. But the classified addendum he'd received through former military channels told a different story entirely. This girl wasn't just another military brat. She was the adopted daughter of Major James Kade, a decorated Special Forces operative whose Black Ops record was mostly redacted and whose current work remained need to know. "Keep an eye on her butt. Give her space," the note had said. "She's been through enough." When Lina appeared in his doorway, Rourke was struck by her stillness. Most teenagers fidgeted or slouched, but she stood with perfect posture, hands loose at her sides in a way that suggested readiness rather than tension. "Miss Kade, welcome to Raven Ridge. I trust you'll find our academic environment challenging but rewarding," he said, handing her a class schedule that placed her in all advanced courses. "If you need anything, my door is always open." There was something in his tone that suggested he meant more than academic guidance. 3 periods into her first day, Lina had already mapped every exit route, memorized the faces of potential threats, and identified the social hierarchies that ruled this place like invisible kingdoms. She kept her head down in a P history, where the teacher droned about World War II battles that Lina's father had made her study from declassified military perspectives. She said nothing when her lab partner in chemistry assumed she wouldn't understand the complex equations, and she ignored the whispered comments about her clothes and accent that followed her through the halls. It was during 3rd period English that she first encountered Jace Amini, a slight Iranian-American boy with intelligent dark eyes who sat in the back corner, hunched over a laptop, covered in cybersecurity stickers when 3 seniors cornered a freshman near the classroom door, demanding his lunch money in the casual way that suggested this was routine business. Lina watched the scene unfold for exactly 10 seconds before standing up and walking over. "Hey," she said quietly to the seniors, her voice carrying just enough authority to make them pause. "Maybe pick on someone your own size." The seniors looked at this slight new girl with amusement. "Oh great, another hero." One of them sneered, but something in Lina's steady gaze made them reconsider their fun. They muttered complaints about freaks sticking together and walked away, leaving the freshman to scurry to his seat while shooting grateful glances at Lina, who had already returned to her desk as if nothing had happened. From his corner seat, Jace Amini watched this interaction with growing fascination. There was something different about this girl, something that went beyond typical teenage rebellion. She moved like water flowed, like someone who understood violence in ways that made her comfortable with confrontation rather than afraid of it. And when she'd spoken to those seniors, there had been no fear in her voice, just calm certainty that she could handle whatever came next. Meanwhile, across the school, Dax Mercer was holding court in advanced placement government. The quarterback's letterman jacket stretched across broad shoulders as he leaned back in his chair with the careless confidence of someone who'd never been seriously challenged in his life. At 17, he stood 6'2", the kind of classical good looks that had made him king of Raven Ridge since freshman year. His father, Senator Richard Mercer, had taught him early that power was something you took and held through force of will and careful image management. "Did you guys see the new girl?" asked Tyler Kim, sliding into the seat next to Dax. "Weird vibe, totally doesn't fit the Raven Ridge aesthetic." Dax had indeed noticed her, the way she'd walked through the halls like she was mapping territory rather than just finding classes. There was something about her stillness that bothered him. Most new students either tried too hard to fit in or collapsed under the weight of social pressure. But this girl seemed entirely unimpressed by the whole ecosystem he'd built his reputation on. Behind them, Brielle Voss flipped her platinum hair over one shoulder and examined her manicured nails with practiced indifference. As the unofficial queen of the school, she'd perfected the art of psychological warfare through exclusion and social manipulation. At 16, she commanded the loyalty of dozens of girls who desperately wanted to be her, and the attention of boys who saw her as the ultimate prize. But there was something unsettling about how the new girl had looked right through all of it. Like none of it mattered. "She's probably just some military brat daddy got stationed somewhere new," Brielle said with deliberate disinterest, but her mind was already working, calculating angles and weaknesses, because girls like that, quiet, confident ones who didn't immediately bow to the established order, were dangerous to the careful balance she'd spent years creating. Give her a week and she'll either fall in line or transfer out. They always do. But as the day wore on and Lina continued to move through Raven Ridge like a ghost who saw everything and revealed nothing, Dax found himself increasingly fascinated and irritated by her presence. She didn't try to sit at the popular tables, didn't attempt to make friends with the right people, didn't even seem to care that she was being evaluated and judged by every student in the school. And that indifference to his world felt like a challenge he couldn't ignore. The cafeteria at Raven Ridge High was a sprawling monument to adolescent hierarchy, with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over manicured grounds where the Pacific Northwest drizzle painted everything in shades of gray and green. Students clustered at tables that might as well have had velvet ropes around them, marking the invisible boundaries between the powerful and the powerless, the achievers and the outcasts, the predators and the prey. Lina had chosen a small table in the corner near the emergency exit, not because she was antisocial, but because 15 years of her father's training had taught her to always know where the exits were and to never sit with her back exposed. She unpacked her simple lunch from the worn canvas backpack, methodical and efficient in her movements, while scrolling through a secure messaging app that connected her to her father's current location somewhere in Eastern Europe. The weight of the backpack felt heavier today, though she couldn't figure out why it held the same things it always did: textbooks, a tablet, some personal items, and the small concealed pocket her father had sewn into the lining for emergency cash and identification. But something felt off about the balance. Well, what do we have here? The voice belonged to Dax Mercer, who approached her table with the swagger of someone who'd never been told no in his life. Flanked by Tyler Kim and Brad Morrison, a stocky wrestler whose perpetual sneer suggested he enjoyed other people's pain. Behind them trailed Brielle Vos and her court of perfectly groomed followers, all of them drawn to this moment like sharks to blood in the water. Lina looked up from her phone, immediately cataloging the threat level: 3 athletic males, 1 manipulative female, and an audience of at least 40 students who had stopped eating to watch the show unfold. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. Assess the situation, identify the primary threat, and calculate your options, but always try to de-escalate first. Violence should be your last resort, not your first choice. I'm Dax, you're the new girl, right? Lina something, he said, sliding into the seat across from her. Without invitation, his two companions flanked the table, creating a wall of intimidation, while Brielle hung back with her followers, watching the proceedings with the detached interest of someone watching a nature documentary about apex predators. It's Lina Kade, she said quietly, her grip instinctively tightening on her backpack straps while her eyes tracked the positions of everyone around her, the exits, the potential weapons, the innocent bystanders who could get hurt if this escalated beyond words. Is there something you need? Tyler leaned forward with a laugh that carried no warmth. Need? That's cute. What we need is to understand how things work around here. See, Raven Ridge has certain standards, certain expectations, and walking around looking like you shopped at a thrift store doesn't exactly fit our image. Your image, Lina repeated, her voice carrying a flatness that should have warned them. They were walking into dangerous territory, but teenage arrogance made them deaf to the subtle signals that screamed predator. I'm not trying to fit any image, I'm just trying to eat my lunch. Brad Morrison cracked his knuckles with theatrical menace. See that attitude right there? That's the problem. You think you can just show up here and act like you're better than everyone else, like our opinions don't matter. His voice was getting louder, drawing more attention from the surrounding tables, where students had pulled out phones to record what looked like entertainment. I don't think I'm better than anyone, Lina said, standing up slowly at her full height. She barely reached Dax's shoulder, but there was something in her posture that suggested coiled steel beneath the calm exterior. I just want to be left alone. Dax reached across the table with lightning speed, snatching her backpack before she could react. Let's see what's so important in here that you're clutching it like a life preserver. Maybe we can help you upgrade your whole situation. He held the bag just out of her reach while his friends laughed and the crowd pressed closer, sensing climax. Give it back, Lina said, and something in her voice made the hair on the back of Jace Amini's neck stand up from his table 20 feet away. He watched her stance shift imperceptibly, weight transferring to the balls of her feet, hands moving to a ready position that looked casual but felt anything but. Or what? Brielle called out from behind her protective wall of followers. You going to cry about it? Maybe call your daddy to come rescue you. The laughter that erupted from the surrounding students cut through Lina like broken glass, but not because it hurt her feelings, because it reminded her of other crowds in other places, where violence had been the currency of survival and mercy. was a luxury no one could afford. Her father had taught her to control her emotions, to think strategically, but 16 years of training couldn't completely suppress the primal response that someone was threatening her possessions, her safety, her autonomy. "Please," she said one more time, her voice carrying a warning that only Principal Rourke would have recognized from his intelligence days. "Just give me my backpack and we can all go back to our lunch." "I don't think so," Dax said, unzipping the main compartment and making a show of looking inside. "Wow, even your stuff is boring, just books and—" He stopped, his expression changing as his fingers found something unexpected in the side pocket, something that felt like metal and plastic, wrapped in what felt like classified materials. That's when Lina moved. The first motion was so fast that most of the crowd missed it. Her left hand struck Dax's wrist with surgical precision, hitting the nerve cluster that made his fingers go numb, and forced him to drop the backpack while her right hand caught the bag before it hit the table. Then she was standing again, backpack secured, her expression unchanged as if nothing had happened, while Dax stared at his tingling hand in shock. "What the hell?" Tyler started to say, but Lina's gaze fixed on him with the kind of intensity that made him step backward involuntarily. This wasn't a normal teenage girl. This was something else entirely, something that understood violence in ways that made grown men uncomfortable. "My backpack," she said, simply slinging it over her shoulder. "My business now, if you'll excuse me, I have class." She walked away from the table with measured steps while the entire cafeteria sat in stunned silence, trying to process what they'd just witnessed. Brad Morrison found his voice first. "Did you see how fast she moved? That wasn't normal. That was like military or something." But Dax wasn't listening. He was staring at his hand where a small bruise was already forming and wondering how a girl who barely came up to his chest had made him feel like a child playing with forces beyond his understanding. From his corner table, Jay Samini watched Lina disappear through the cafeteria doors and felt something shift in his worldview. He'd spent 3 years being invisible at Raven Ridge, except in his place at the bottom of the food chain, but this girl had just rewritten the rules of engagement with a single precise movement, and suddenly being invisible didn't feel like protection anymore. It felt like cowardice that night. Lina sat on her bed in the small apartment she shared with her father's absence, the rain drumming against the windows of their temporary housing like Morse code messages from a world that refused to leave her alone. Her laptop screen glowed with the secure video feed that connected her to Major James Kade, currently stationed at a forward operating base, whose location she wasn't cleared to know, even though she could identify it from the construction of the walls behind him and the quality of light filtering through the bulletproof glass. "How was your first day, kiddo?" Major Kade asked, his weathered face creased with the kind of concern that came from spending 16 years teaching a child to survive in a world that had already tried to kill her once. His gray eyes held the sharp intelligence that had made him one of the most effective operatives in special forces history, but they also held the gentle worry of a father who wanted nothing more than for his daughter to have a normal life. "There was an incident," Lina said, because she'd never learned to lie to the man who'd pulled her from the wreckage of her biological parents' compound in Syria when she was 6 years old, and taught her that honesty was the foundation of trust. And trust was the only thing that kept you alive in a hostile world. "Some boys tried to take my backpack. I had to retrieve it." The change in her father's expression was immediate and alarming. His casual demeanor vanished, replaced by the tactical assessment mode that had kept him alive through 12 deployments in places that didn't officially exist. Define tried to take Lina. "How much force did you use? What did they see? What do they know?" "I disabled one target's grip reflexes and retrieved the package without escalation beyond necessary parameters," she said, falling back into the military terminology that had been her first language before. She'd learned to speak like a civilian. No weapons were visible, no classified techniques were exposed. The incident appeared to observers as lucky reflexes rather than tactical training. Major Kade nodded slowly, but his eyes remained hard. "Show me the backpack." "Lina, open every compartment. Check every pocket. I need to know exactly what they might have seen or felt. There was something in his voice that made her stomach drop a tone. She recognized from the worst days of their life together, when staying alive meant following orders without question. Lina pulled the backpack onto her bed and began methodically checking each section: textbooks in the main compartment, tablet and chargers in the secondary, pocket pens and notebooks in the small front section. But when she reached the concealed pocket her father had sewn into the lining, her fingers found something that made her blood freeze. A small rectangular object wrapped in what felt like classified material storage plastic. "Dad," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "there's something in the hidden pocket, something that wasn't there this morning." She pulled out a military-grade flash drive, wrapped in documentation that bore the kind of classification stamps that could get people killed for possessing them without proper clearance. Major Kade's face went white. "Get that away from the camera. Don't let me see it. Don't tell me what's on the labels, just tell me if it looks like something that should be in a 16-year-old's backpack." His voice carried the controlled panic of someone who just realized his worst nightmare was coming true. "Negative, sir, this is definitely not civilian equipment." Lina said, her hands shaking slightly as she rewrapped the device and placed it back in the concealed pocket. "Dad, what's going on? Who put this in my bag, and why didn't I notice the weight difference?" "Because you're not paranoid enough yet, and that's my fault for wanting you to have a normal life," Major Kade said, running his hands through his graying hair. "Lina, listen to me very carefully. That device was never meant to be in your possession. Someone used you as an unwitting courier, which means someone knows who you are, where you are, and what your connection to me might be worth." The implications hit her like a physical blow. 16 years of careful anonymity, of new identities and cover stories, and constant relocation had been designed to keep her invisible to the kind of people who might use a retired operator's daughter as leverage or revenge. But somehow that protection had been compromised. "The boys who tried to take your backpack today," Major Kade continued, "did any of them seem particularly interested in the weight or the feel of it? Did anyone react strangely when they handled it?" His tactical mind was already working through scenarios and threat assessments, calculating the probability that Lina's cover had been blown versus the possibility that she'd been randomly selected as a courier. The primary target seemed surprised by something in the side pocket, Lina said, forcing herself to remember details through the adrenaline haze of confrontation. He went from casual harassment to focused searching, like he knew something was supposed to be there. Major Kade closed his eyes for a long moment, and when he opened them, they held the kind of resignation that came from watching careful plans crumble. "Despite your best efforts, 16 years, Lina. 16 years of keeping you safe, of teaching you to protect yourself, of trying to give you a chance at a real life, and it comes down to some entitled teenage bullies stumbling onto classified materials in a high school cafeteria. What do I do?" she asked, because for the first time since childhood, she felt genuinely afraid, not of physical violence which she could handle, but of the implications of being dragged back into a world she'd never really escaped from, a world where her father's enemies might finally have found a way to hurt him through the one person he cared about more than his own life. "You do what I trained you to do," Major Kade said, his voice hardening with resolve. "You assess the threat, you protect yourself and the asset, you trust no one except Principal Rourke, who has clearance to know about your background. And you stay alert, because if someone knows you have that device, they're going to come for it, and they won't care about collateral damage." The call ended with tactical instructions about dead drops and emergency protocols, but Lina barely heard them over the sound of her normal life crumbling around her like a house of cards in a hurricane. She'd known this day would come eventually, had trained for it, prepared for it, but she'd hoped for a few more years of pretending to be just another teenager worried about grades and social drama instead of classified intelligence and black ops consequences. She lay back on her bed, staring at the ceiling while rain continued its assault on the windows, and tried to reconcile the girl who just wanted to finish high school with the weapon her father had shaped her into from necessity and love. The backpack sat beside her, feeling Heavier now, not because its contents had changed, but because she finally understood the true weight of what she'd been carrying all along. Outside in the darkness, someone was watching her apartment, building through night vision equipment, making notes about her schedule, her routines, the best approaches for when they finally made their move. But Lina didn't know that yet tomorrow she would learn that some mistakes echo through generations, and that the price of her father's service was a debt she might spend her entire life paying. The Whisper campaign began the next morning, like poison spreading through the pristine hallways of Raven Ridge High School. Brielle Voss had spent the entire night crafting her strategy with the precision of a general planning a siege, because direct confrontation had failed spectacularly when Lina demonstrated skills that no normal teenager should possess, but psychological warfare that was Brielle's domain, where she reigned supreme with an arsenal of social weapons that had destroyed reputations and crushed spirits for 3 years running. "Did you hear about the new girl?" she said to Madison Cole during first period, a P. Literature, her voice pitched just loud enough for the surrounding students to overhear. "Apparently she's some kind of military brat with serious anger management issues. I mean, who attacked someone over a backpack? It's obviously filled with weird survival gear or something equally disturbing." The lie mixed seamlessly with truth, creating the kind of narrative that spread like wildfire through the social ecosystem of teenage gossip. By second period, the story had evolved. Lina wasn't just aggressive, she was dangerous, possibly unstable, definitely not the kind of person you wanted to associate with if you cared about your reputation or your safety, Madison told her lab partner in chemistry, who told his girlfriend in drama, who whispered to her best friend in calculus, that the new girl had practically assaulted Dax Mercer in front of half the school and gotten away with it because the teachers were too scared to intervene. "I heard she knows like martial arts or something," Tyler Kim added to a cluster of football players near the lockers, his voice carrying the nervous excitement of someone spreading information that felt dangerous. Brad said her hands moved so fast he couldn't even see what happened. 1 second, Dax had her bag. The next second he was dropping it like it burned him. The story grew in the telling, as stories do, until Lina became a legend of violence wrapped in the thin disguise of a quiet transfer student. Lina felt the change immediately in the way conversations stopped when she walked past, in the sudden silence that followed her into classrooms, in the wide berth students gave her in the hallways, as if her presence might contaminate them with whatever darkness they imagined she carried. She'd experienced social isolation before in the various schools and communities where her father's work had taken them, but this felt different, more calculated, more personal. During third period government class, she watched Dax Mercer hold court from across the room, his arm draped possessively around Brielle's shoulders while he told his version of yesterday's encounter to anyone willing to listen. "She just snapped completely over nothing," he said, his voice carrying the wounded innocence of someone who'd never been held accountable for his actions. "I was just trying to be friendly, maybe help her fit in. And she goes all psycho ninja on me. It's honestly scary what they're letting into this school these days." The teacher, Mrs. Patterson, seemed oblivious to the undercurrent of tension that filled her classroom like static electricity before a storm. She droned on about constitutional amendments while her students passed notes and exchanged meaningful glances that spoke volumes about shifting alliances and social boundaries. Lina took careful notes, not because she needed to learn about the Bill of Rights, which her father had made her memorize, along with military law and international treaties, but because focusing on the familiar rhythm of academic work helped her maintain the facade of normalcy. It was during lunch that the isolation campaign reached its peak. Lina approached 3 different tables, only to watch students suddenly remember urgent conversations elsewhere or discover pressing homework that required their immediate attention. She finally settled at the same corner table from the day before, but this time the buffer zone around her was wider, more deliberate, as if she carried some invisible contagion that might spread through proximity. "Mind if I sit here?" The voice belonged to Jay Samini, who appeared beside her table with a lunch tray and a laptop bag covered in cybersecurity conference stickers. His dark eyes held a mixture of curiosity and determination that reminded Lina of her father when he'd decided on a course of action, regardless of the potential consequences. "It's not exactly the popular choice right now," Lina said quietly, glancing around at the students who were watching this interaction with the fascination of spectators at a gladiator match. "You sure you want to associate with the school's new pariah?" Jace slid into the seat across from her with deliberate casualness. "I've been the school pariah for 3 years now, might as well have some company besides." He opened his laptop and angled the screen so only she could see it. "I've been thinking about what happened yesterday, and I have some questions about the technical specifications of your reaction time." Something in his tone made Lina look up from her sandwich to study his face more carefully. There was intelligence there, sharp and analytical, but also a kind of lonely determination that she recognized from her own mirror. "Technical specifications," she repeated, carefully testing the waters of this unexpected conversation. 0.7 seconds from initial grab to target neutralization, Jace said quietly, his fingers dancing across the keyboard as he pulled up what looked like frame-by-frame analysis of cell phone video. "That's not normal teenage reflexes, that's trained muscle memory, probably involving significant practice with disarm techniques and pressure point manipulation." He paused, looking up at her with eyes that held no judgment, only fascination. "So either you're the most naturally gifted athlete in the history of Raven Ridge, or someone taught you how to hurt people efficiently." Lina felt her carefully constructed walls crack slightly in the face of his matter-of-fact assessment. Most people saw what they expected to see: teenage drama, social hierarchies, the surface tensions that drove high school politics. But Jace was looking deeper, asking questions that could unravel everything. "Why does it matter to you?" she asked, keeping her voice neutral while her mind calculated the risks of this conversation. "Because I've spent 3 years watching bullies like Dax Mercer terrorize anyone who doesn't fit their definition of acceptable." Jace said, his voice carrying years of suppressed anger and frustration. "And yesterday, for the first time, someone made him look weak, made him back down without throwing a punch or calling for help. He did something I've been dreaming about doing since freshman year." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither of them was sure they wanted to cross. Lina had spent her entire life being taught that trust was earned through actions, not words, that revealing your capabilities to the wrong person could get you killed. But there was something about Jace's honesty that reminded her of her father's lessons about recognizing potential allies in hostile territory. "Hypothetically speaking," she said carefully, "if someone had received training in personal protection, what would be the best way to keep that information from spreading beyond this table?" It wasn't quite an admission, but it was close enough to test his reaction and gauge his trustworthiness. Jace's eyes lit up with the kind of excitement that came from solving a particularly complex puzzle. Hypothetically, the key would be controlling the narrative, making sure the official version stays mundane and explainable while ensuring that anyone with recording devices understands the consequences of sharing sensitive footage. He paused, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. "Of course, that would require a certain level of technical expertise to identify and neutralize digital threats." "Technical expertise," Lina repeated, feeling the pieces of an unexpected partnership beginning to fall into place around them, like a chess game where both players were finally revealing their true strategies. "That sounds useful in a hypothetical situation involving sensitive information that might need protection." "Very hypothetical," Jace agreed, pulling a small device from his laptop bag that looked like a standard USB drive but felt heavier than it should, especially if that information happened to involve encrypted data that someone might want to understand better. He placed the device on the table between them, where it sat like a question mark waiting for an answer. Lina stared at the USB drive, feeling the weight of decision pressing down on her like gravity. Her father had taught her to be suspicious of coincidences, to question anyone who appeared at exactly the right moment with exactly the right Skills, but Jace had been at Raven Ridge for 3 years, had been systematically ignored and dismissed by the same social structure that was now targeting her. And sometimes the enemy of your enemy really was the alliance you needed to survive. Hypothetically speaking, she said, reaching into her backpack to retrieve the flash drive she'd discovered the night before. If someone needed help understanding what they'd accidentally acquired, this might be exactly the kind of technical expertise that could save lives. She placed the drive next to his on the table where they sat like two puzzle pieces waiting to be connected. Jace's expression shifted from curiosity to alarm as he recognized the military-grade encryption signature and classification markings that were visible even through the protective wrapping. "Lina," he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "what exactly did those boys try to steal yesterday, and how deep are we about to get ourselves buried?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that would change everything they thought they knew about high school social warfare, because some battles weren't about popularity or status. They were about survival and the information. Sitting on there, preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Lunch table had the potential to get them both killed if they made the wrong choice about who to trust, and how far they were willing to go to protect each other. That evening in the cluttered sanctuary of Jace, Amini's bedroom, where multiple monitors cast blue light across walls covered with cybersecurity, conference posters and computer hardware in various states of assembly, the true scope of what Lina had been carrying became clear with each line of decrypted code that scrolled across his screens like digital prophecy, revealing secrets that neither of them was cleared to know but couldn't afford to ignore. "This isn't just classified material," Jace said, his voice tight with a mixture of fear and fascination as layers of military-grade encryption peeled away under his careful digital assault. "This is surveillance footage from locations that don't officially exist, meeting recordings between people who aren't supposed to know each other, and what looks like comprehensive blackmail operation targeting U.S. officials at the highest levels of government." Lina sat on his desk chair watching the files populate across multiple screens while her mind raced through the implications of what they were discovering. Her father had taught her to compartmentalize information, to focus on immediate threats rather than getting overwhelmed by the bigger picture. But this was bigger than anything she'd been prepared to handle. "Can you tell who created it or how it ended up in my backpack?" The metadata suggests it was compiled by someone with access to multiple intelligence agencies. Jace set his fingers dancing across 3 keyboards simultaneously as he traced digital fingerprints through layers of obfuscation. But the interesting part is the timestamp. This package was assembled yesterday morning, about 2 hours before you arrived at Raven Ridge, which means someone knew exactly where you'd be and when. The revelation hit Lina like ice water in her veins, because it meant her cover hadn't just been blown, it had been deliberately targeted by someone who understood her connection to Major Kade and saw her as either a valuable asset or a useful pawn in whatever game they were playing. "Show me the surveillance footage," she said, because sometimes the only way through fear was straight into the heart of what scared you. The first video file opened to reveal what looked like a congressional office building after hours, where 2 men in expensive suits were exchanging briefcases while discussing offshore accounts and defense contracts in voices that carried the casual corruption of people who'd never imagined their conversations might be recorded. The second file showed a federal judge accepting what appeared to be instructions about upcoming cases from someone whose face was carefully kept out of frame. "There are dozens of these files," Jace said, scrolling through a directory that read like a who's who of American political power. Senators, congressmen, cabinet members, federal judges, all of them compromised, all of them being controlled by someone who's been very patient and very thorough in building this network. "And now that someone knows I have it," Lina said, feeling the weight of target designation settling on her shoulders like a familiar burden, "which means they're going to come for it. And they won't care about collateral damage." Her father's training kicked in, automatically assessing escape routes, calculating response times, wondering how long they had before this digital investigation turned into something far more physical and dangerous. Meanwhile, across town in the opulent Mercer family mansion, Dax was pacing his bedroom like a caged predator while his ego nursed wounds that had been festering since yesterday's humiliation in the cafeteria. He'd spent the evening crafting what he thought was the perfect plan to restore his reputation and put the new girl in her place once and for all, because public embarrassment demanded public redemption, and he had the resources and influence to orchestrate exactly the kind of spectacle that would remind everyone who really ruled. Raven Ridge High School, tomorrow during the pep rally, he said into his phone while Brielle listened. From her own perfectly appointed bedroom across town, we're going to give everyone a show they won't forget. I'm going to publicly apologize to Little Miss Ninja for yesterday's misunderstanding, really humble pie stuff, you know. And then when she's off guard thinking she's won, I'm going to reveal what a fraud she really is. What exactly are you planning, Dax? Brielle asked, though her tone suggested she already knew. She wouldn't approve of whatever scheme he was concocting in his wounded pride, because if this backfires worse than yesterday, you're going to drag all of us down with you. It won't backfire, Dax said with the absolute certainty of someone who'd never faced real consequences for his actions. I've got Brad and Tyler ready to help, and I figured out the perfect way to expose her in front of the entire school. She wants to play games with people who have real power. Well, she's about to learn what that actually means. The pep rally at Raven Ridge High was a monthly tradition where the entire student body gathered in the gymnasium to celebrate athletic achievements and school spirit. But it was also the perfect venue for social theater, where reputations could be made or destroyed in front of an audience that would remember and retell the story for years to come. Dax had used these events before to cement his status as king of the school. But tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow would be his masterpiece of public manipulation. I'm going to challenge her to a friendly sparring match, he continued, his voice growing more excited as he worked through the details. Make it sound like I want to learn some of those moves she showed yesterday. Really respectful and admiring, you know, and when she either has to back down and look weak or actually fight me in front of everyone, she'll be exposed as either a fraud or a psychopath. Either way, I win. Brielle felt a chill of unease because she'd seen something in Lina's eyes during the cafeteria incident, something that suggested this girl wasn't playing by the same rules as everyone else at Raven Ridge. Dax, what if she's actually dangerous? What if she really does know how to fight and decides to show everyone exactly what she's capable of? Then she'll be expelled for violence on school grounds, Dax said with satisfaction. And I'll be the victim who tried to make peace but was attacked by an unstable transfer student. It's perfect either way. She's gone, and I'm the hero who tried to give her a chance. He paused, his voice dropping to the tone he used when he was absolutely certain of his own brilliance. Besides, how dangerous can one teenage girl really be? Back in Jace's bedroom, the question of danger was being answered in real time as more files decrypted to reveal the scope of the intelligence operation Lina had unknowingly become part of. This isn't just blackmail, Jace said, his voice barely above a whisper, as financial records and communication logs painted a picture of systematic corruption that reached into every branch of government. This is evidence of a shadow network that's been operating for years, maybe decades, and someone wants it back badly enough to use a 16-year-old girl as a courier. Lina said, her tactical mind working through scenarios and probabilities, which means they're either desperate enough to take massive risks or confident enough in their power to believe they can clean up any mess we might make. The sound of a car engine outside Jace's window made them both freeze as headlights swept across the room like searchlights, probing for targets. But it was just his neighbor coming home late from work. Not the black SUVs that haunted Lina's nightmares from childhood memories of extraction operations and safe house evacuations. But the false alarm reminded them both that they were sitting on information that could get them killed. We need to copy everything and create multiple backups, Lina said, falling back on her father's protocols for handling sensitive intelligence. And we need to figure out who we can trust, because keeping this secret is going to be a lot harder than uncovering it. She paused, looking at Jace with the kind of intensity that came from making life or death decisions. Are you sure you want to be part of this? Because once we go down this road, there's no going back to normal teenage problems. Jace met her gaze with determination that surprised them both. Normal teenage problems include getting stuffed in lockers and having my lunch money stolen, he said with quiet conviction. If helping you means finally standing up to the bullies who've made my life hell for 3 years, then I'm in all the way. Besides, he gestured at the screens full of evidence. Someone needs to make sure this information reaches the right people before it gets buried or weaponized. Outside in the darkness, a figure in a sedan parked 2 blocks away adjusted night vision equipment and made notes about the configuration of Jace's bedroom windows, the number of escape routes from his house, and the best approach vectors for a team that would need to retrieve stolen property without leaving witnesses but inside the house. 2 teenagers were discovering that some secrets were worth dying for, and that sometimes the most dangerous enemies were the ones who looked exactly like everyone else. The next afternoon, as October rain hammered against the windows of Raven Ridge High School, like nature's own percussion section, marking time until violence erupted in the academic sanctuary where teenagers played at being civilized, while predatory instincts simmered beneath designer clothes and privilege-bought confidence. Lina moved through her final period with the heightened awareness that came from spending a sleepless night analyzing classified intelligence and preparing for threats that could come from any direction at any moment. She'd spent lunch period with Jace in the computer lab where they'd created multiple encrypted backups of the flash drive contents and uploaded select files to secure servers that would automatically release the information if they failed to check in within predetermined timeframes. It was the kind of dead man switch protocol her father had taught her for handling intelligence that was too dangerous to keep but too important to destroy. And now they were committed to a course of action that would either expose a massive corruption network or get them both killed. The pep rallies. In an hour, Jace had whispered during their final synchronization of backup systems, Dax has been telling anyone who'll listen that he's planning something special for the new girl during the assembly. I think he's going to try to humiliate you publicly as payback for yesterday. Lina had nodded while her mind calculated probabilities and response options, because public confrontations were tactical nightmares, where collateral damage was inevitable and escape routes were limited. But she'd also spent 16 years learning that sometimes the best defense was letting your enemies think they had you cornered while you planned their downfall. Let him try, she'd said with the quiet confidence of someone who understood violence in ways that entitled teenagers never would. But make sure you're recording everything that happens. Now, as the final bell echoed through hallways filled with students rushing toward lockers and freedom, Lina packed her books with methodical precision, while tracking the movements of potential threats through peripheral vision and reflected surfaces her father's training had made. Situational awareness as natural as breathing, but the weight of the real flash drive hidden in her backpack made every shadow feel like a potential ambush. She was halfway to the exit when they cornered her in the locker bay near the gymnasium, where the acoustics would muffle any sounds and the sparse foot traffic would minimize witnesses. Dax Mercer emerged from behind a bank of lockers flanked by Brad Morrison and Tyler Kim plus 2 football players she didn't recognize, creating a wall of muscle and adolescent aggression that blocked her path to safety. Well, if it isn't our resident ninja, Dax said, his voice carrying the false friendliness that predators used to put their prey at ease. I've been looking for you all day. We need to have a little chat about respect and how things work around here. His eyes held the cold calculation of someone who'd spent the night planning this moment and believed he held all the advantages. I told you yesterday, I don't want any trouble. Lina said, her voice steady while her body automatically shifted into a ready stance that looked casual but positioned her for maximum mobility and striking efficiency. Her backpack felt heavier now, not just from the classified intelligence, but from the knowledge that these boys had no idea what they were about to unleash. Brad Morrison cracked his knuckles with theatrical menace. Troubles already here, sweetheart. The question is whether you're going to make this easy on yourself, or if we're going to have to teach you some manners the hard way. He stepped closer, invading her personal space in the classic intimidation move that worked on normal teenagers but triggered threat assessment protocols and someone trained to recognize pre-attack indicators. See, here's the thing, Tyler said, pulling out his phone and activating the camera function. Yesterday you embarrassed my boy Dax in front of half the school, and that kind of disrespect has consequences. You're going to apologize publicly, and then you're going to transfer out of Raven Ridge because this place isn't for people like you. The two football players moved to flank her, cutting off escape routes, while Dax stepped forward with the swagger of someone who'd never lost a physical confrontation because his size and status had always been enough to make opponents back down. But Lina wasn't backing down. She was calculating angles and distances and the precise amount of force needed to neutralize 5 targets without causing permanent damage. Last chance, Dax said, reaching for her backpack with the same casual entitlement that had started this war. Hand over the bag. Apologize for being a freak, and maybe we'll let you walk out of here without needing medical attention. His fingers brushed the strap, and that's when 16 years of special forces training took over. Lina moved like liquid lightning, her left hand deflecting Dax's grab while her right struck his solar plexus with surgical precision, dropping him to his knees, gasping for air while she spun to catch Brad's incoming punch, redirecting his momentum to send him crashing into the lockers with a sound like thunder. Tyler lunged forward, but found himself on the ground with his arm twisted behind his back in a submission hold that could dislocate his shoulder if he moved wrong. The two football players hesitated for a crucial second, unsure whether to help their friends or run, and that hesitation cost them everything because Lina was already moving her backpack secured across her shoulders as she swept the legs of one and struck the pressure points that would numb the other's arms for 20 minutes, leaving all 5 of them on the ground in various stages of consciousness and pain. I warned you, she said, quietly looking down at Dax, who was still struggling to breathe. I asked you to leave me alone. I tried to avoid this, but you wouldn't listen. Her voice carried no anger, just the flat professionalism of someone who'd done what was necessary to protect herself and her mission. Tyler's phone had captured everything from the moment Dax grabbed for her backpack to the final takedown that left them scattered across the floor like broken toys. And as Lina walked away from the scene, she knew that this video would change everything at Raven Ridge High School, because now everyone would see exactly what she was capable of when pushed too far. But she also knew that somewhere in the shadows people with more dangerous agendas were watching too, and that the flash drive in her backpack had just become a target that would draw threats far more serious than teenage bullies, because some secrets were worth killing for, and the enemies her father had made during 20 years of black ops work were patient enough to use his daughter as bait to draw him into the open. The locker bay fell silent, except for the groaning of injured boys who'd learned too late that some prey fought back with training that turned the hunter into the hunted. And as emergency sirens began to wail in the distance, Lina disappeared into the maze of hallways, knowing that her normal life at Raven Ridge High School was over, but that the real war was just beginning, because adolescent predators were nothing compared to the professionals who would come for her next. Behind her, Tyler's phone continued recording, capturing the aftermath of violence that had erupted in the space between childhood and the adult world, where consequences were measured in broken bones and classified intelligence rather than social media likes and homecoming votes. And somewhere in a secure facility hundreds of miles away, analysts were already reviewing the footage and updating threat assessments for a target who'd just proven she was far more dangerous than anyone had calculated. By morning, Tyler Kim's cell phone video had exploded across social media platforms like digital wildfire, spreading through networks that connected Raven Ridge High School to the wider world, where violence captured in high definition became entertainment for millions of viewers who had no idea they were watching the daughter of a Black Ops operative defend herself against teenage predators with training that most adults would never possess in their entire lives. The video had been edited and remixed, set to music turned into memes, and analyzed frame by frame by amateur fight enthusiasts who debated technique and wondered where a high school girl had learned to move like a professional soldier. "Holy shit, have you seen this?" became the refrain echoing through hallways, where students clustered around phones and tablets watching Lina Kade dismantle 5 attackers with the kind of efficiency that belonged in action movies, not academic institutions. The footage had gone viral beyond the school's social ecosystem, reaching platforms where military veterans and martial arts experts weighed in with commentary that ranged from impressed to deeply concerned about what kind of training produced those results. Principal Hadley Rourke sat in his office staring at multiple screens displaying the video from different angles while his secure phone buzzed with calls from federal contacts who were asking very pointed questions about why a classified asset was trending on TikTok and whether his facility had been compromised by foreign intelligence services looking to exploit a teenage girl's connection to retired Special Forces operations that officially never existed. "Ms. Kade, please come in and close the door," he said when Lina appeared in his doorway at exactly 8:15 that morning. Her punctuality, another indicator of military conditioning that most civilians wouldn't recognize, but Rourke's intelligence background made him notice details that revealed training and discipline beyond anything a normal teenager should possess. "Sir," Lina said, taking the seat across from his desk while her eyes automatically cataloged the room's security features, the reinforced windows, the panic button hidden beneath his desk, the small camera in the corner that was currently deactivated, and the way his body language suggested controlled concern rather than administrative irritation. "I'm going to ask you some questions, and I need honest answers because the situation we're dealing with has implications that go far beyond school disciplinary procedures," Rourke said, pulling out a file marked with classification levels that made Lina's stomach drop. "First question. How much does your father know about what happened yesterday and what you've discovered about the contents of your backpack?" The directness of his approach told Lina that her cover story was completely blown and that trying to maintain the fiction of being a normal transfer student would be both pointless and potentially dangerous. "He knows about the initial confrontation, but not about the intelligence asset or the analysis my partner and I conducted," she said, falling into the precise language of operational debriefing. "Your partner would be Jace Amini, the boy who's been helping you decrypt classified materials that neither of you has clearance to access," Rourke said, consulting notes that suggested he'd been monitoring their activities more closely than they'd realized. "What exactly did you find on that flash drive, and who else knows about it?" Lina weighed her options while calculating the probability that Rourke was genuinely trying to help versus the possibility that he was part of whatever network had used her as an unwitting courier. But his body language suggested authentic concern, and her father had trained her to recognize interrogation techniques versus collaborative intelligence sharing, surveillance footage, and financial records, indicating a systematic blackmail operation targeting federal officials, she said, keeping her voice steady while watching his reaction. "The metadata suggests it was compiled by someone with multi-agency access, but we haven't been able to identify the source or determine why it ended up in my possession." Rourke nodded grimly while making notes that looked more like tactical assessments than disciplinary records. "What you've stumbled onto is the work of Marcus Vale, a former CIA operative who went rogue 18 months ago and has been building a private intelligence network funded by selling state secrets to the highest bidder. Your father was part of the task force hunting him, which makes you a natural target for leverage or revenge." The revelation hit Lina like a physical blow because it meant her presence at Raven Ridge High School wasn't coincidental. It was part of a calculated strategy to draw her father into the open by threatening the one person he cared about more than his own life. "How long have you known?" she asked while her mind raced through implications and tactical responses. "Since the day you enrolled," Rourke admitted. "I have contacts in the intelligence community who flagged your arrival as part of a federal protection program, but yesterday's incident has blown your cover completely, and now we have agents from multiple agencies asking questions about what exactly happened in my school, outside the principal's office." The normal rhythm of high school life continued, but with an undercurrent of tension that came from viral celebrity and whispered rumors about the girl who could fight like a soldier while looking like any other teenager. Brielle Voss found herself struggling to maintain social control as students who'd previously hung on her every word began questioning whether their allegiance to the old power structure was worth maintaining in a world where real violence had consequences. "She's just a freak with anger issues," Brielle insisted to her inner circle during lunch, but her voice lacked the conviction that had once made her pronouncements feel like social law. "I mean, seriously, who acts like that over some stupid teenage drama? It's completely psychotic and probably illegal." But Madison Cole, who'd been Brielle's most loyal lieutenant for 2 years, was looking at her phone where the comments on Tyler's video told a different story. "People are calling her a badass," she said quietly. "They're saying she stood up to bullies who had it coming, and that maybe it's time someone showed Dax that his money and status don't make him untouchable." The shift in social dynamics was subtle but unmistakable as students who'd previously accepted Dax Mercer's reign as natural law began questioning whether fear was really the best foundation for teenage hierarchy. Noah Chun had spent the morning in the nurse's office, claiming stomach problems but really trying to process the guilt that came from years of silent complicity in his childhood friend's transformation into a predator. "I should have said something," he whispered to himself while staring at the ceiling tiles that reminded him of the grid pattern his therapist had taught him for organizing complicated emotions. "All those times he went too far, all those kids who got hurt, and I just stood there because it was easier than standing up to him." Meanwhile, in a nondescript sedan parked 3 blocks from Raven Ridge High School, 2 federal agents reviewed surveillance footage and updated threat assessments for an operation that had suddenly become exponentially more complicated. "The target's operational security is compromised," Agent Sarah Martinez reported into her encrypted radio. "Viral social media exposure plus civilian involvement means we need to accelerate the timeline for asset recovery." "Copy that," came the response from a voice that carried the flat professionalism of someone coordinating multiple moving pieces across a chessboard that spans several states. "Vale's people are already in motion. We have reports of unknown individuals asking questions at local hotels and car rental agencies, which means they're closing in on the target's location." Agent Martinez adjusted her scope while tracking movement patterns around the school building. "Recommend immediate extraction of both the asset and the civilian ally before this turns into a shooting war in a high school parking lot," she said, because 16 years of federal law enforcement had taught her to recognize when a situation was about to spiral beyond containment. But 3 miles away, in the secure communications center of a private military contractor, Marcus Vale was studying the same viral video with the cold satisfaction of someone whose careful planning was finally bearing fruit. "Perfect," he said to his assembled team of former intelligence operatives who'd followed him into the lucrative world of privatized espionage. "The girl's cover is blown. Her father will come running to protect her, and we'll finally have our chance to settle some old scores while recovering assets that belong to us." The trap was closing around Raven Ridge High School with the precision of a military operation, but at its center was a teenage girl who'd been trained since childhood to survive exactly this kind of multi-vector threat, even if it meant burning down the normal life she'd hoped to build. In the rain-soaked forests of the Pacific Northwest, where secrets had a way of surfacing like bodies in deep water, and the price of her father's service was measured in the safety of the one person he'd sworn to protect above all others: the phone. Call came at 3:17 a.m. when darkness pressed against the windows of Lina's temporary apartment, like a living thing hungry for the secrets hidden behind bulletproof glass and reinforced door frames that her father had installed before deploying to his current classified location somewhere in Eastern Europe, where time zones meant nothing and operational security meant everything. Principal Rourke's voice carried the controlled urgency of someone delivering intelligence that could mean the difference between survival and catastrophe. "We have movement," he said without preamble, because both of them understood that secure communications were a luxury they couldn't afford when hostile forces were converging on their position. Federal surveillance detected a team of unknowns conducting reconnaissance around the school perimeter and asking questions at local businesses about a teenage girl matching your description. "They're not law enforcement." Lina was already moving as he spoke, her body responding to threat indicators with the automatic efficiency her father had drilled into her through years of emergency preparedness training. She pulled on tactical clothing and began assembling the go bag that lived in her closet, ready for immediate deployment. If her cover was ever compromised, how long do we have before they make their move? She asked while checking the backup flash drives and emergency communication devices that connected her to extraction protocols. "Best estimate is 12 to 18 hours before they feel confident enough to attempt direct action," Rourke said, consulting intelligence reports that painted a picture of professional operators moving with military precision. "But we're not going to wait for them to choose the time and place of engagement. I have a proposal that could end this situation permanently." 20 minutes later, Lina met Rourke and Jace, Amini, in the empty computer lab where multiple screens displayed topographical maps, satellite imagery, and communication intercepts that revealed the scope of the threat converging on Raven Ridge High School, like storm fronts meeting over a target that had no idea it was about to become ground zero for a conflict between former allies turned enemies. "Marcus Vale wants that flash drive badly enough to risk operating on U.S. soil," Rourke explained while highlighting movement patterns that showed coordinated surveillance around the school and surrounding community. "But he also wants revenge against your father for the operation that ended his intelligence career, which means he'll come personally if he thinks he can capture both the asset and leverage against Major Kade." Jace had been silent during the briefing, but now he leaned forward with the kind of nervous determination that came from making decisions that could get you killed. "What exactly are you proposing? Because I'm pretty sure whatever plan involves using Lina as bait violates about 15 different federal regulations regarding the safety of minors. We're going to give him exactly what he wants," Rourke said with the cold smile of someone who'd spent years in military intelligence learning that sometimes the best defense was a perfectly executed offensive operation. "A scared teenage girl alone in the woods with the flash drive trying to make a dead drop to her father will use the original device's bait while keeping the copid intelligence secure." The plan was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. Lina would position herself at predetermined coordinates in the state forest that bordered Raven Ridge's campus, carrying the original flash drive and transmitting on frequencies that Vale's team would be monitoring, making it appear that she was attempting to contact her father for emergency extraction. Meanwhile, Rourke would coordinate with federal assets to surround the area and capture Vale when he moved to intercept what he believed was a vulnerable target. "The risk assessment is unacceptable," Lina said, falling back on the tactical language her father had taught her for evaluating mission parameters. "If Vale's team consists of former intelligence operatives, they'll recognize standard federal positioning and either abort the operation or eliminate the target to prevent asset recovery, which is why we're not using standard federal positioning," Rourke said, pulling up communication logs that showed he'd been coordinating with contacts whose names were redacted but whose response times suggested significant resources I still have friends in the community who owe me favors and understand that sometimes unofficial operations are the only way to protect national security. At 11:30 that night, Lina moved through the darkened forest with a predatory silence. Her father had taught her during childhood games that were really survival training disguised as play. The original flash drive hung around her neck like a talisman, while encrypted communication devices kept her connected to Rourke's coordination center and backup teams positioned throughout the woods like invisible guardians. The clearing she'd chosen was tactically sound with multiple escape routes and sight lines that would reveal approaching threats while providing cover for defensive positions if the operation went sideways. Her father had taught her that successful missions depended on controlling variables and maintaining initiative. Even when you appeared to be the vulnerable party, contact, she whispered into her throat microphone as movement registered at the edge of her peripheral vision. 3 figures approached through the trees with the coordinated precision of military operators who'd worked together long enough to communicate through subtle gestures and positioning. Marcus Vale emerged from the shadows like a ghost materializing from darkness, his weathered face carrying the cold satisfaction of someone whose patient planning was finally bearing fruit. "Hello, Lina," he said, his voice carrying false paternal warmth that reminded her of every predator her father had warned her about. "I believe you have something that belongs to me, and I have some questions about your father's current location that you're going to help me answer." But Lina had spent 16 years learning that appearances could be weapons, and that sometimes the most dangerous predators were the ones who underestimated their prey. "I have exactly what you're looking for," she said, reaching for the flash drive, while her other hand found the emergency beacon that would signal the trap's activation. "But you're not going to like what you find." The next 30 seconds unfolded with the brutal efficiency of professional violence as Vale's operatives moved to secure their target, only to discover that the scared teenage girl was actually a weapon shaped by special forces training and activated by threats to her survival. Lina disabled the first operative with pressure point strikes while rolling behind cover that materialized from federal agents who'd been positioned throughout the clearing like pieces on a chessboard. Vale found himself surrounded by professionals who'd been hunting him for 18 months and who finally had him isolated in terrain of their choosing. But even as zip ties secured his wrists and federal agents read him rights that would disappear into classified detention facilities, he stared at Lina with the kind of respect that came from recognizing a worthy adversary. "Your father trained you well," he said as they loaded him into an unmarked vehicle that would transport him to questions and consequences that fell outside normal legal channels. "But this isn't over the network I built has resources and patience that your family can't imagine." Rourke appeared beside Lina as the vehicles disappeared into darkness, carrying threats and secrets back to facilities where dangerous knowledge was contained and neutralized. "It's finished," he said, but both of them knew that victory in intelligence warfare was always temporary, and that enemies like Marcus Vale left behind successors who learned from captured assets and planned more carefully for the next operation. The forest returned to silence as if violence had never disturbed its ancient peace, but somewhere in the digital networks that connected global intelligence operations, new threats were already analyzing the night's events and calculating different approaches to acquiring assets that a teenage girl carried in a backpack that had become the center of conflicts she never chose to join. 3 weeks after the forest operation that officially never happened, according to federal records that would remain classified for decades, Raven Ridge High School had settled into a new equilibrium where old hierarchies crumbled like ancient architecture, unable to support the weight of students who'd witnessed real violence and discovered that teenage social warfare felt insignificant compared to the life and death stakes that some of their classmates navigated every day. Lina walked through hallways that had once felt hostile with the quiet confidence of someone who'd proven herself in combat against enemies far more dangerous than entitled adolescents. But the change in atmosphere went deeper than simple respect born from fear. Students approached her now not with the cowering deference that Dax Mercer had demanded, but with genuine curiosity about the girl who'd rewritten the rules of what was possible at their privileged institution. "Hey, Lina," called Emma Martinez, the red-haired girl who'd tried to defend her during the original cafeteria incident. "I was wondering if you might be interested in helping with something we're organizing. It's kind of an informal self-defense group for students who want to learn how to protect themselves." The invitation came during lunch period, in the same corner where Lina had once sat alone while social predators circled like sharks, testing her vulnerability. But now that table had become an unofficial gathering place for students who'd found each other through shared experiences of being targets and a collective desire to never feel helpless again. Jasamini looked up from his laptop where he was monitoring encrypted communications that kept them connected to Federal Protective Services while maintaining the fiction that they were normal teenagers worried about grades and college applications. "We've got about 15 people interested so far," he said quietly. "All kids who've been dealing with bullying or worse, and want to learn practical skills for staying safe." The self-defense club that emerged from these conversations operated in the gray space between official school activities and underground resistance movements, meeting in empty classrooms after hours where Lina taught modified versions of the techniques her father had drilled into her since childhood, always emphasizing de-escalation and escape over confrontation, while preparing her students for the reality that sometimes violence was the only language predators understood. "Rule number 1, she said to the group of nervous teenagers who'd gathered for their first session. "Your goal is never to win a fight. Your goal is to survive, and escape fighting should always be your absolute last resort. When every other option has been exhausted." Her voice carried the authority of someone who'd learned these lessons through experience rather than theory. Noah Chun had been among the first to join the group. His guilt over years of silent complicity in Dax's reign of terror transformed into determined action as he helped recruit other students who'd suffered in silence while the old power structure protected bullies and punished victims. "I should have stood up sooner," he said during one session while practicing basic escape techniques. "All those times I watched him hurt people and did nothing because it was easier than risking my own social status." The confession resonated through the group because most of them carried similar burdens of choices not made and voices not raised in defense of others. But Lina understood that guilt could be transformed into purpose if channeled correctly. "You're standing up now," she told him, "and you're helping others do the same. That's what matters." Meanwhile, Brielle Voss found herself increasingly isolated as students who'd once competed for her approval began questioning the toxic foundation of the social hierarchy she'd built through manipulation and exclusion. Her attempts to reassert control through gossip and rumor campaigns fell flat against the reality that most of the school had watched viral video of actual violence and found teenage drama comparatively trivial. "She's just a freak with military parents," Brielle insisted to the rapidly shrinking circle of girls who still sought her approval. But even Madison Cole, who'd been her most loyal follower for 2 years, was looking at her with the kind of critical assessment that suggested shifting loyalties. "Maybe," Madison said carefully, "but she also stood up to guys who were twice her size and had been terrorizing people for years, while we all just watched and pretended it wasn't our problem." The words carried weight because they acknowledged complicity in a system that protected predators and silenced victims. Dax Mercer had become a ghost haunting the edges of his former kingdom, unable to reclaim authority that had evaporated the moment his physical dominance was revealed as hollow performance. His father's political influence still protected him from official consequences, but couldn't restore the fear-based respect that had been his primary currency at Raven Ridge High School. "Just stay away from her," he muttered to anyone who asked about Lina, his voice carrying the hollow echo of someone who discovered that all his advantages meant nothing against an opponent who understood real violence. "She's not worth the trouble, trust me." But the transformation of Raven Ridge went beyond individual students to encompass The entire culture of the institution, where teachers noticed that bullying incidents had dropped dramatically and that students seemed more willing to report problems rather than suffering in silence. The change was subtle but unmistakable, as if the demonstration of consequences had reminded everyone that actions had weight. Principal Rourke watched these developments with satisfaction, tempered by vigilance, because his intelligence background made him understand that victories in asymmetric warfare were always temporary, and that enemies adapted their strategies rather than abandoning their objectives. The Federal Protection Detail remained in place around Lina and her activities, but threats evolved, constantly requiring new countermeasures. It was during the 4th week of their new normal that Jace's secure communication system intercepted a message that made both of them freeze with recognition of danger returning. Like a tide that had only temporarily receded, the text was simple and unsigned but carried implications that chilled them both. Marcus Vale was just the beginning. The network he built has new leadership, and they haven't forgotten about the girl who cost them their operation. Lina read the message twice while her mind automatically shifted into threat assessment mode, calculating probabilities and preparing for the reality that her normal life at Raven Ridge High School might be ending, just as she'd begun to believe it was possible. "How did they get through your encryption?" she asked, because the technical sophistication required suggested resources that went beyond normal criminal organizations. "They didn't." Jace said, his face pale with implications he didn't want to acknowledge. "This message was routed through channels that only federal agencies should have access to, which means either our protection has been compromised or someone with official credentials is working for the other side." The possibility hung between them like a sword suspended by thread, because it meant that nowhere was truly safe, and that the enemies her father had made during 20 years of Black Ops work had patience and resources that could reach into institutions they'd trusted with their lives. But it also meant that everything they'd built at Raven Ridge, the relationships and purpose they'd discovered through shared struggle, might be temporary shelter in a storm that was far from over. Outside their secure meeting room, the normal sounds of high school life continued, students worrying about tests and relationships and college applications, while two teenagers grappled with knowledge that some wars never truly ended. They just found new battlefields where the stakes remained life and death, even when disguised as adolescent concerns about popularity and social status. 6 months later, as spring rain replaced winter storms in the endless Pacific Northwest cycle of water and renewal that marked time in the forest surrounding Raven Ridge High School, Lina Kade stood before 37 students in the converted storage room that had become the unofficial headquarters of what everyone now called simply the club, though its full name in the student handbook read Personal Safety and Conflict Resolution Society, because bureaucratic language was required to make revolutionary ideas palatable to school administrators who preferred their rebellions properly filed and supervised. The transformation had been gradual, like erosion wearing away mountains one grain at a time, until the landscape itself became unrecognizable from what had existed before. But the changes were undeniable in the way students walked through hallways with straighter spines and steadier gazes, and the dramatic decrease in bullying incidents reported to the principal's office, and in the quiet confidence that had replaced the fear-based hierarchy that had ruled the school for generations of entitled adolescents who'd never learned that power without responsibility was just another form of violence. "Today we're going to talk about situational awareness," Lina said to the mixed group of students that included former victims and former bystanders, united by their shared commitment to never again allowing predators to operate unopposed in their community. Not just physical threats, but emotional manipulation, social isolation, and the kind of psychological warfare that leaves scars you can't see but that hurt just as much as broken bones. Emma Martinez raised her hand from the front row where she sat with the focused attention of someone who discovered purpose through collective action. "What about when the threats come from people in authority positions, teachers or coaches who use their power to silence complaints about their behavior? It was a question born from experience rather than hypothesis because the club had become a safe space where students shared stories that had been buried under shame and fear, authority figures who abuse their position are counting on your isolation and your belief that no one will believe you over them, Lina said, falling back on lessons her father had taught her about asymmetric warfare, where the powerful maintained control by convincing the powerless that resistance was futile. But predators in positions of authority have one crucial weakness. They need institutional protection to operate, which means they're vulnerable to coordinated exposure that threatens their reputation. Jace Amini looked up from his laptop, where he was documenting techniques and strategies for the encrypted digital library they'd created to preserve institutional knowledge for future generations of students who would face similar challenges. We've also developed secure reporting systems that allow anonymous documentation of incidents with timestamps and verification protocols that make it harder for authority figures to dismiss or suppress complaints. The evolution of the club from informal self-defense training to comprehensive resistance network had been organic rather than planned as students discovered that personal protection required community action and that changing individual behavior meant transforming systemic cultures. That enabled predators while silencing victims, but the success of their approach had attracted attention beyond Raven Ridge High School. We've gotten requests from students at other schools who want to start similar programs, said Noah Chun, who'd become one of the most effective recruiters and trainers, despite or perhaps because of his background as a former insider in the power structure they were dismantling. Apparently, word is spreading through social media about what we've accomplished. Here, the irony wasn't lost on any of them that the same viral networks which had initially exposed Lina's capabilities were now carrying stories of empowerment and collective action to communities where students had given up hope that anything could change. But grassroots movements had always depended on demonstration rather than theory, on showing that alternatives were possible before expecting people to believe in transformation. Change spreads like infection, Lina said with a slight smile that acknowledged both the positive and dangerous implications of their success. Which means we need to be prepared for immune responses from systems that depend on maintaining the status quo. Her father's training in geopolitical analysis had taught her that successful revolutions always triggered counter-revolutions from those whose power depended on oppression. Principal Rourke had become an unexpected ally in their efforts, partly because his intelligence background made him recognize the value of early warning systems that identified problems before they escalated to violence, but also because he'd witnessed firsthand how institutional change could prevent the kind of catastrophic incidents that destroyed communities and ended careers in federal investigations. The statistics speak for themselves. He'd told the school board during budget discussions about formalizing support for student-led safety initiatives. Reported incidents of harassment and violence are down 63% from last year, while academic performance and student satisfaction surveys have improved dramatically across all demographic categories. But not everyone appreciated the transformation that had swept through Raven Ridge like a quiet revolution disguised as extracurricular activities. Brielle Voss had transferred to a private academy in California, where her family's wealth could still purchase the kind of social dominance that had become impossible in a community where students refused to accept hierarchies based on fear and exclusion. Dax Mercer remained at Raven Ridge, but as a ghost haunting the edges of his former kingdom, unable to reclaim authority that had evaporated the moment his victims discovered they had choices beyond submission or silence. He'd attempted to rebuild his influence through his father's political connections, but found that teenage social dynamics operated according to different rules than adult power structures. He tried to get his dad to pressure the school board into shutting down the club. Madison Cole had reported during one of their leadership meetings, claimed we were promoting vigilante violence and undermining proper authority, but apparently Principal Rourke had documentation that made the senator decide his son's problems weren't worth the political risk. The Federal Protection Detail had gradually scaled back their presence around Lina and Jace as threat assessments indicated that Marcus Vale's network had been successfully disrupted, but both teenagers understood that security was an illusion in a world where enemies had patience measured in decades and resources that spanned international boundaries. It was on a Tuesday evening in late April when the spring rain drummed against the windows of her apartment with the same rhythm that had marked her arrival at Raven Ridge 8 months earlier, that Lina found the package waiting outside her door, unmarked and innocuous, except for the weight that suggested something more significant than routine mail or promotional materials. Inside the manila envelope was a photograph that made her blood freeze, despite years of conditioning that had taught her to remain calm. Under extreme stress, it showed two people she recognized from childhood memories that had been carefully buried under layers of training and survival instinct, her biological parents, standing together in what looked like a refugee camp somewhere in the Middle East, smiling with the kind of desperate hope that people maintained in war zones where tomorrow was never guaranteed. The note attached was brief and typed on plain paper without identifying marks or letterhead, but the message carried implications that chilled her more than any physical threat. You were never off the grid, Lina Kade. We've been watching and waiting for the right moment to remind you that some debts pass from generation to generation. Your parents made choices that had consequences, and now it's time for you to pay what they owed. For several minutes she sat on her bed staring at the photograph, while her mind raced through tactical assessments and emotional responses that her training had taught her to separate, but which now seemed inseparable because this wasn't just about intelligence operations or national security. It was about the family she'd lost and the father who'd saved her and the life she'd built on foundations that were apparently more fragile than she'd believed. Her first instinct was to call Major Kade to activate emergency protocols that would extract her from Raven Ridge and relocate her to another identity in another community where she could start over with new cover stories and carefully constructed normalcy. But as she reached for her secure phone, her eyes fell on the group photo from last week's club meeting. 37 faces looking back at her with trust and determination. They'd learned from her guidance. No, she said quietly to her empty apartment while rain continued its percussion against bulletproof glass. Not this time, not when we've built something that matters. Because running would mean abandoning the community they'd created and the students who depended on the club for safety and purpose, and the slow revolution that was transforming Raven Ridge from a predator's paradise into something resembling actual civilization. Instead, she opened her laptop and began composing encrypted messages to Jace and Principal Rourke and the network of federal contacts who maintained oversight of her situation, because this time she wouldn't face the threat alone. She had allies and resources, and most importantly, she had something worth protecting that went beyond her own survival. The next morning she walked through the hallways of Raven Ridge High School with the same measured confidence that had marked her arrival, but now it carried additional weight. The knowledge that enemies were watching and planning while she continued the work of teaching students to protect themselves and each other, because that was what her father had really trained her for, not just survival, but service to something larger than her own fear. Everything okay? Jace asked during their usual morning check-in, his analytical mind immediately detecting subtle changes in her demeanor that suggested new variables in their ongoing security equation. New developments, she said quietly, while her eyes automatically tracked potential threats in the familiar environment of their adopted home, but nothing we can't handle as long as we stay smart and stick together. It wasn't complete honesty, but it was tactical truth, the kind of limited disclosure that protected operational security while maintaining team cohesion. During lunch period, she stood before the club's expanded membership and felt the weight of responsibility that came from knowing that these students had trusted her with their safety and their hope for something better than the toxic culture they'd inherited from previous generations of adolescents. who'd mistaken cruelty for strength. "We've accomplished something remarkable here," she said, looking at faces that reflected confidence born from collective action rather than individual fear. "But change is never permanent. It requires constant vigilance and commitment, because there will always be people who prefer systems where the strong prey on the weak and where silence protects predators." Emma Martinez nodded from her usual spot in the front row. "So what do we do when new threats emerge, when people try to destroy what we've built here?" It was the question that hung over every successful resistance movement, because victory was always temporary in conflicts where ideology and power intersected. "We remember that courage is contagious," Lina said with the quiet certainty of someone who'd learned that some things were worth fighting for regardless of personal cost. "And we trust that what we've started here will spread to other communities where students need to know that they have choices beyond submission or suffering in silence." That evening she stood at her apartment window watching rain fall on the forests that surrounded Raven Ridge while her mind worked through scenarios and contingencies for threats that might emerge from the shadows where enemies planned their next moves with patience, born from decades of practice in asymmetric warfare. The photograph of her biological parents sat on her desk like a question mark waiting for an answer, but she'd already decided that some questions were less important than the work that needed to be done tomorrow and the day after that, and for as long as it took to ensure that the club would survive and thrive even if she couldn't. She was no longer the frightened child who'd been pulled from the wreckage of her parents' compound or the isolated teenager who'd arrived at Raven Ridge hoping only to disappear into normalcy. She was something new entirely, a protector who understood that the most effective weapons were often the communities you built and the people you empowered to protect themselves. Outside in the darkness, figures moved through the rain with military precision, conducting surveillance and updating threat assessments for operations that remained classified. But Lina was ready for whatever came next because she'd learned that the quiet war was never really over. It just found new battlefields where the stakes remained the same: survival and the right to choose your own definition of strength. The package had been a message, but she'd already sent her reply through every student who walked straighter through hallways that belonged to them now, through every former victim who'd learned to recognize manipulation before it could take root, through every bystander who'd discovered that neutrality was just another form of complicity in systems designed to protect predators tomorrow. There would be new challenges and unknown threats, but tonight Raven Ridge High School belonged to the students who'd fought for the right to feel safe in their own community, and that was worth whatever price the future might demand from the girl who'd taught them that courage was just fear walking forward anyway into whatever darkness waited beyond the next corner. The rain continued its ancient rhythm against her windows like Morse code messages from a world that had always been dangerous, but which now contained pockets of light where young people learned that they were stronger together than apart, and that some wars were worth fighting even when victory was measured in the quiet confidence of walking through hallways without fear. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.